Welcome to another best of episode. This is an episode from a previous season of the podcast before the podcast was hosted here on the main Enemies Within the Church YouTube channel. You can still go to EWTC News Podcast YouTube channel or search EWTC News on any podcast platform you can get your hands on, and you can find the entire backlog. We just wanted to get some of these episodes that we thought were extra helpful here so a larger audience could see them, or at least another audience could see them. Now, what is this episode? This is actually a supercut of two episodes. We did a two-part series where we looked at ethnicity, ethnos, nation. What is this idea from the Bible? What is this idea of race? All these things together to try and get an idea of, in the first half, what does the Bible mean when it says ethnos? And in the second half, we looked at the juicy things. How is ethnicity abused and misused in order to manipulate people? And in this case, it's, well, the thing we focus most on, which is woke manipulation. You don't want to skip ahead to the second half, though, because the first half really is critical in establishing a foundation. And no matter where you're at in your understanding of things, you will definitely gain something from that look at getting a good foundation. Now, let's hop in. Like I said, this is super cut, so there's going to be a little bit of jumping cuts and other things. I tried to shorten things up. I tried to cut out some of the intros, outros, things like that. So hopefully it is good. Yes, it is a little bit long, but it is worth it. So let's jump in.
But as we were getting ready for this podcast, there's one thing that that you noted specifically, Kyle, was that if you look up the word ethnicity in a multiple dictionaries, the one thing that is the consistent trait is that it's often not consistently defined, or it's defined simply by synonyms often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something that's hard to nail down. It's one of those things where we can identify it faster than we can define it. But even right. our identifying still requires a definition to give kind of the framework for it.
Right. And so when we're looking at this, we're going to look at this in a few different ways. We're going to look at this, I would say, as a people group, and then we're also going to look at it as a nation, because those seem to be the two types, the two really broad general ideas as to how this word is used. Does that sound fair?
We need to put some definitions and edges on this to its multiple multiple meanings.
Right. And even I think as I read the Strong's definition, you can see that it's used in multiple ways, often dependent upon the context that are there in Scripture. And so we're going to try to put some verses in context. Well, we're not going to try. We are going to put some verses in context. And I think it will help you grasp this. And if you really get the good foundation for this, we're really going to apply it to see where people are abusing it next week. And so you're going to be able to see, how do you apply biblical truth to the culture? But we need to get into this. And as we're going to get into this, we're doing something a little bit different today. I'm excited for this. We're going to be playing a game.
What this game is simply, I'm going to be showing a picture. And Sam, don't overcomplicate it, but just, you're allowed to think a tiny bit, but I'm going to ask you, just what guess. Ethnicity is the person and or people? Sometimes there's multiple people. Right. What ethnicity
I haven't seen these
are
pictures
they?
ahead of time.
The whole idea is, before we really get into ethnicity, wanted to stretch your minds a little bit of how you see ethnicity, because I think the modern ideas of scientific race, so race, the idea of race that's rooted in evolution, that was dominant in the 20th century, and now sociological race rooted in critical race theory, this idea as race as a social construct, have warped, because so often ethnicity and race were used as synonyms, and historically at one point they were synonyms, but you have to go back several hundred years to hit that point. It's left us with a little bit of a taste of ethnicity that I want to stretch a little bit, and this is going to be fun. Quirks of language and ethnicity are something I find fascinating. But Sam, If you had to guess an ethnicity for these four women, they're all the same ethnicity. What would you guess?
I mean, it looks extremely European to me.
Well, that's not a ethnicity. You have to go to an actual.
Do you have to name a country?
You have to name a people group. Yes.
I would say they look like they're from England. I mean,
okay, is that your final answer?
That's my final answer. I mean, they look very, very white, but not Norse. So,
nope, yeah. Nope.
Where are they from?
You are wrong. These are Magyars. These are Hungarians.
What?
Yeah, they're Hungarians. How did you not know that? Wasn't that obvious? So let's go on to the next one.
Okay.
Okay, you got this man here. If you had to try and put an ethnicity, and try and be more specific than something like sub-Saharan African. European's not acceptable. Large geographic continental region is not acceptable. Give me something.
I'm going to say, like, from Congo.
So you think he's Congolese?
Yes.
No, you'd be wrong. This is a Hungarian. Let me continue on.
Are they all Hungarians?
I should probably explain what I mean by that. This is because someone's like, what are you talking about? No, this is a Magyar, not Arab. Magyar, so the native name for Hungarian. Ab, the Nubian term that means tribe, the tribe of the Hungarians. This is a descendant of a Ottoman slave, because let's call it what it was, stealing children from their homes and forcing them to fight in wars. That's slavery. Who then got abandoned in the lower Nile, the upper Nile, and mixed with the native Nubian people, but never lost their knowledge that they were Hungarians. These people, which if you are not seeing this visually, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people with the most just bright red hair that you ever done seen.
Yeah, I mean,
incredibly pale faced.
Yeah, I mean, these are my kind of people right here. I like the red hair. You know, my wife's hair is red. My hair is reddish, and our dog's hair is red. And I would guess that they must be from either Ireland or Scotland. They're interestingly, I think that Scotland has more red hair. You know, I mean, they look like they like Lucky Charms.
Don't forget the Welsh. Come on, you're gonna name the two other major.
We don't like the Welsh.
Oh, we have problems now. You are talking to someone who's like one, some small amount Welsh. I am of the Medlicott family. How dare you? I'm also related to King Duncan of Scotland, the one that dies in Macbeth. So either way, you think this is one of the major Celtic people groups that are left? Irish, Scottish.
Yeah.
Like how confident are you on that? How confident?
Yeah,
a rating of 1 to 10.
I mean, I would say 1 for at least every charm that's in a bowl of Lucky Charms. I mean, that's how high on that.
Oh my goodness. No, these are the Udmurt people from the farthest part of Europe that you can get, right on the edge of the Ural Mountains before you hit into Asia, in Russia. They have never had any genetic contact ever with Celtic people.
That's insane.
Yeah. In fact, they have more red hair per capita, at least it's claimed that they have more red hair per capita than any of the Celtic peoples. Fun fact.
Wow.
Would you like to continue on with this? This is a fun game.
Yeah. I mean, is there more?
There is more. Okay. You got several different people here. 2-part question, because we got multiple people. Are these all the same ethnicity or all these different ones? And what ethnicity or ethnicities would you guess? And just you can
Okay,
pick the front. You
so
can pick the front three people since they're the most easiest to see.
yeah. So I mean, my initial would say they're not the same ethnicity, all of them. And I mean, you have, it looks to me like a Native American type. It might not necessarily be Native American, uh, but kind of a Native American, and then also Asian, right? The girl looks Native American to me, and then the guys look like they're probably from, not quite China. I don't know. A little bit west of there, but I can't think of a country that would be there, but around that Asian area. That's not very specific. Sorry.
No, that's pretty decent. Well, one, they're not. None of them are Native American.
Okay,
They are.
I would guess, especially with like, with what they're wearing and stuff too.
Nope, not even
Really,
close. These are the all of them are the same. Even the if you look the one lady, you can't really see her very well on the far
right?
right, who has pretty light
Lighter
brown
hair.
hair. That's not just an effect of the sun either. These are the Selkut people. These are all the same people, and we're not talking like vague large people group. Like these are all the same small people group. They're all immediate together, same tribe. The Selkut people from essentially just over the Ural Mountains from where the Udmurts were. So
Okay,
let's
so
continue
I
on.
wasn't too far off on that one then. On
You
my
were
second
further
guess
you were
for the
further
guys.
off than you were. You had to go. You didn't give me anything that put it more north. They're much more
That's
north
true.
and west than
Yeah.
you were saying. Okay, now these two guys. Which ethnicities are? Which ethnicity is the guy on the left? Which ethnicity is the guy on the right? There's kind of a twofer here.
Okay, are they the same ethnicity? Because like, there's no way they're the same ethnicity.
You tell me. I'm not
No,
telling you anything until you give me answers.
they're not the same ethnicity. My mind is really confused on this one because I mean, what in the world
You're
is
making me
going?
happy with how successful this game is going so far.
Well, okay, so I mean, I'm just gonna go with my gut, which my gut is definitely wrong. But the guy on the right, I'm gonna say an Eskimo, but it's more because of what he's wearing. The guy on the left, I mean, I wish his hair was like really blonde because then I feel like I would know exactly where he was from. But I, it, I'm just gonna say Russia because the European side of Russia.
The European side of Russia. Do you think he's a European Russian?
Yes.
No, these are both men from the same people group, same tribe.
No
These are
way.
also both. Yep. These are both Selkut people as well. Uh, and again, that they're from kind of central Siberia, like
Okay.
central western
So
Siberia.
so the guy on the left, I wasn't insanely far off.
Well, except for the fact that he's not Russian.
Yeah.
There might be some Russian admixture in them, but it's not.
I
It's
mean
not
that's,
substantial.
you know, it's on the same map.
Not the same people though. Okay, next one. I'm throwing in an easy one. Okay, I'm throwing an easy one to break it up before we go to the final one.
There's no easy one in this.
There's no easy one in this. What are you
There's
talking
no
about? This
easy
one's
one in
easy.
this. My mind is playing so many tricks on me. Like I'm like, is this guy from Australia? I have no idea at this point. I'm fairly certain he's not from Australia. If he's from Australia, especially with that background, I mean that was not a nice one to do here. I'm gonna go with a northern Native American.
So you think like So you think like from he's from up where I am.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, you need to learn your like. Wow. See, I thought you were going to say he looks like he's Korean or something.
Well, okay, that's what I thought, but like I'm looking at the back, like the backdrop here. I'm trying to I'm trying to get something from the picture, not just the person, because I've noticed that the people are very deceiving.
Do you not realize how North Korea actually is?
No, apparently
Like
not. Apparently, I need to work on my geography too.
It does actually get more. Does get more snow. Anyway, you're wrong, and no, and neither is this man Korean. This is a Nanette person from very northern, from the Arctic coast of Siberia.
What?
Okay, last one.
I'm gonna say Romanian.
What she looks Romanian. Okay, you're just kind of going out there. I like it though. I like the committal. I just think the little like 6-ish-year-old looking girl.
I have no idea what I'm
dressed
looking
in
at.
that outfit.
To tell you the truth, this
adorable
picture.
Little picture. It warms my fatherly heart. Also, she looks like she needs to get warm. But
yes, I take it she's not from Romania.
No, this is also a Nanette person. This is this man and this little girl are from the same small, isolated people group. We're not talking like a broadly distributed people group with millions of members. No, these two people are the same ethnicity.
Huh.
And again, we're not talking about people groups that are insanely heavily mixed. We're talking about lots of isolation. Now, want me to blow your mind even more?
Sure.
Want me to blow your mind even more? Looking through all these, like, look at that, look at that, look at that. Look at all these different people. What if I told you that those are all from the same greater people group? Now, if people who don't know, the Hungarians, the Magyar people, they actually migrated into Europe from the eastern side of the Ural Mountains, aka they're from Asia originally.
Not for like all one Asian or two of them, that makes sense.
Well, for Asian people are not, we have an image of what Asian means.
Mm-hmm.
Not true. And again, those are all from the same people group. Now you can see different admixtures. You can see how being on one side of the Ural Mountains, they got mixed with, over time, they got some mixture from Turkic people and Mongolic people. But fascinating to me. And so what I mean by greater people group, anyone that's wondering what that'd be like saying Germanic peoples. That's the same level of distinction that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's incredible to look at. And while it doesn't make sense to the eyes or to the mind that you're perceiving, it does make sense when we look at the scope of Scripture, because, well, Kyle, where does ethnicities really come from? Where do we get this in the story in Scripture?
Well, when it comes to the Scripture itself, where does ethnicity start in a way that can start to fit the definitions that we're talking about? It comes from the Tower of Babel. Yeah. Before that point, all people were unified under a single language, single identity, single location. They'd not spread over the earth. They had not diverged linguistically. They were united, and God wanted them to scatter across the earth. He wanted this diversity that he put into humanity to start to take hold, to have the whole earth subdued. And one of the punishments was they'd lose the unity of language.
Right.
So though I think genetic diversity was always there, I think linguistic diversity wasn't the standard plan.
Right.
Obviously, God knew where things were going to go. It's not like it surprised him at all, but that wasn't the original intent. Just like humanity was never supposed to fall, but we sinned. But that's where we see ethnicity. We see the spreading of the nations.
That's right, and it is interesting to go and to really look at that, because when we see the Tower of Babel, it's right after God gave mankind civil government in Genesis chapter 9. He goes and gives that, and then it's Genesis chapter 11 that we have the Tower of Babel. And we see that they came together, and instead of using the new tool that God had given them for obedience, they used it for disobedience. And then it was a curse that came, and there was no longer communication that forced them to obey, essentially, to go and to spread out throughout the world. It and that is where we see different ethnos or different ethnicities really start. Now, one of the biggest things with ethnicity and ethnos and that idea is actually language and what language you're speaking, because that has so much to do with the culture. For instance, if I was speaking, well, I don't know what languages you can speak, Kyle. So, Kyle, if you were speaking in Chinese, I just want you to know I would not understand a word that you were saying. And if you were speaking in Spanish to me, I mean, I might pick up on, El Baño, because I always figured it's good to know to say bathroom just in case you have to go to the bathroom. But um, I wouldn't know what you're talking about. And we would have a tough time communicating. And it wouldn't matter what else we might have in common. There would be a something that would be separating us in there. Is that fair to say?
No, that's totally fair to say. Now, here's a question. Does language automatically make ethnicity?
No.
No. Okay. So what you're saying is there can be times and places when there is a singular ethnicity with multiple languages.
A singular ethnicity with multiple languages. Well, I would have to say it depends on what you mean by ethnicity.
So without going into the details, here's an example. The Hellenistic Jews, were they no longer Jews?
No, they were still Jews. They were still Jews.
Yeah, but they couldn't speak Hebrew. They spoke Greek instead.
True.
But it's just to point out that just because you see two people that speak different languages doesn't immediately mean that, oh, we've got two ethnicities now.
Right.
There's more factors to consider.
Right.
Which is why it's why the different dictionary definitions are always like, good.
Right. And well, and to kind of go along with that, so the word ethnos, which is what we're using here today, it's translated in multiple times. This is from the Strong's Concordance, so this is going to be in the King James. It's used 164 times in the New Testament, and it's used 93 times. It's translated as Gentile. Now that would be a very broad ethnicity, right? I mean, we maybe that's what I should have done for the game, was just went Gentile. No, but no, it's a very broad ethnicity, because it's anything that it's any person that's not an ethnic Jew. It's used 64 times as nation. It's used 5 times as heathen and 2 times as people. And so we start to look at that. Sometimes it's used in a broad sense as a people group. Sometimes it's used in a spiritual group too. Heathen would be a spiritual group, not just a people group, but that would be a spiritual group. And then sometimes it's used as a nation, which is kind of interesting. And when we're looking at that idea of Tower of Babel, I think this is an interesting concept, because we do see from the Tower of Babel, obviously Gentiles, so that physical ethnic group. We also see different nations then begin. So we see a national ethnic group. And eventually down the road, we do see spiritual ethnic groups that end up starting, of course, from that as well. And so that's why I do think the Tower of Babel is the perfect place to go and to see the beginning of ethnos and ethnicity. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's kind of the key is it really does depend on what you mean, and not in that sidesteppy sort of way, but what definition of ethnos, not a made up definition, not an arbitrary definition. There are definitions. Which one are you using? How are you wielding the word? Because that's going to determine what it is we're talking about. And
Right.
I think it's that vagueness of undefined terms that causes a lot of problems in general, but also when we talk about ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's where some of the confusion between modern usages of the word race and ethnicity come into play, and people mix these and then pull in. It's why that game was fun to play, because it toyed with the idea that there are racial features. I mean, I found it
Right.
fascinating that specifically among the same people, and we're talking small people groups,
Right.
you'd have features, physical features that we normally associate with a singular people group.
Right.
And if you have other
For,
features, then you're now not part of that people group. And yet
yeah.
we see them crossing lines that we don't normally think can be crossed.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think I guessed. Now, I might not have been the greatest guesser, but I think I guessed from 1, 2, 3, from 4 different continents. When you look at the Celtic guess and you compare that there's a European guess at the same time, those are almost two different European, like, we understand that as different features. So that's interesting. But
Mm-hmm.
let's look at a Bible verse here that uses the word
Yep.
ethnos in the term of nation, and I think it's going to help us define what a biblical ethnos, when you're using it in the word nation, would mean. And there's some other interesting things I think we're gonna see from this. But in Acts 17:26, it says this: "And he has made from one blood every ethnos nation, of men who dwell on the face on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and their boundaries and their dwellings." But in a short amount of time, how are we to understand this idea of a biblical nation? What are some of the key things there, Kyle, that we see in that verse?
Well, specifically from that verse, we've got it helps us define some of the edges of what an ethnicity, an ethnos can be. We've got things such as they're from one blood. That, the idea of race, separate races of people, doesn't exist. We all
Right, because
come
this
from all ethnicities come from the same origin, the same point. You got the singular point of Noah and his family. You got the singular point of Adam and Eve.
which this is really important because this really dispels the biblical, or excuse me, the worldview of Darwinism. The biblical worldview
Yeah.
is completely contrary from that. Because we're all from the same place, there is the same intrinsic, equal value that is there. And we cannot go and say, because of either a feature, which is generally what happens, or from a location or whatever it might be, that there is different values. You biblically cannot say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people are not based on their biology, because if it's based on their biology, then we all have the same biology. We're all human,
Right.
made in the image of God, and that is an important thing to know. Now, another thing is from that verse, ethnos. I'm gonna put these two together because it kind of puts them together, and I think we can talk about them in this context because there's some comparative things to say here. But an ethnos is bound by time, and an ethnos is bound by location,
Mm-hmm.
the time and place.
Right.
Now, I I've heard people describe that as the rise and fall of nations, as nation states. But is that really what that's saying there? When he was talking about he has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. Is he getting simply at the rise and fall of nations, or is it something a little bit more than that?
I think he's getting into just a little bit more than that. Although I do think that that idea of a biblical, or of a nation, is included in there as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but we do see just this kind of simple idea that it's not just speaking of a nation in general, but also maybe getting smaller into like the people as well, the actual individuals on that.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I've seen with that as well, and this kind of goes into the next point. The next point is not just the time that they exist in and how long they exist. Because is ethnicity stable, or does it morph and change over time?
Oh, I mean, it completely morphs and changes. I mean, because we look at the we look at the society, we look at the culture of an ethnicity. Um, so, for example, because we're going to be talking about language here in just a moment, a little bit more. We've already touched on it. If you've ever gone back and read, we'll say, the Federalist Papers, or just a book of quotes from the founding fathers, and this is not very far back in the grand scheme of things when you're talking about America, but when I started doing that, my wife and I started reading through these kind of things several years ago now. We had to read through it with a dictionary.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. And this wasn't just like this wasn't academic papers. This was reading through the Federalist Papers. They were published in the newspaper for dissemination amongst the general public. But we had to use a dictionary and it wasn't just, oh, hey, they're using these big words that we don't understand. It's these words that they're not used anymore.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it'll be a word that it's still used, but you can immediately go,
that's not right.
They have a different definition. Immediately,
right.
They have a different definition that's radically different than mine.
Right.
So you have to go look it up.
Right.
And that's not very long ago. And sometimes
no, there was still communication.
Words
like I can understand what they were saying, but I'm just going to understand the full detail. I had to use a dictionary. Now imagine you've got a light going on or something there. But imagine if this was 400 or 800 or 1,000 years, even if you're in the same geographic location.
Yeah. Well, okay. Go onto YouTube and look up historically accurate spoken Shakespeare. So they're reading Shakespeare in the I think it's early modern English at that point. And one thing you go, oh, okay, so English is a Germanic language. Because my goodness, does it sound much more German. But it's radical how different it is. Radical. Right. And that's not that long ago. And you only have to go 100, 150 years before that. And you'd struggle, really, really struggle to communicate with that person.
Mm-hmm.
So it rapidly changes over time. So that's important to know. But then the last point is, on what we get out of the verse, is an ethnos, an ethnicity, is also determined by their dwellings. They have not just a location that they occupy, but they have a land.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean they have a political land, as in they have a refined government system that has control over land. Go to like the Mongols, pre-Genghis Khan and getting them to move across and take land. But they were a nomadic people group. They were a more tribal society, but they still had their land. Land is important to an ethnicity. It is a uniting thing.
Right. And I didn't go and look this word up in the Greek, but also dwellings, it could have something to do with literally what they're living inside of. I mean, and so your architecture that reflects your culture can have a lot to do with your ethnicity.
Yeah, and that is a key thing. And again, go back to like the Mongols. What's a word for a house I can say that you immediately go, Oh yeah, Mongols. Yurt. What's a word that if I say it, you'll go, oh yeah, Native American houses. Teepee.
Yeah.
Or wigwam, depending
Yep.
on where you are. There's certain identifiers
Mm-hmm.
that you connect to a specific people group. And because it goes into the land they live in determines their lifestyle and how they communicate with each other, how they relate to one another. Their houses determine how they live and operate. Again, a nomad versus a Northern European that has to have a much more tighter insulated dwelling versus a Middle Eastern architecture that had open top dwellings so they could go out and catch the cool evening and all these different things. They define a place. They help define a people. Now, Sam, there's a couple of things. We've already talked a little bit about one of these, but let's talk about it a little bit more because there's a couple of things that that verse specifically doesn't hit on, but still the Bible does in general and are important to helping us define what an ethnicity is, where its boundaries are.
Yeah, well, and that's language, and then the second one there is religion, right? And going and looking at that, and of course, it doesn't matter. Um, you can have different languages within an ethnos or an ethnicity. We've already kind of touched on that, but as a general rule, they're generally speaking the same language. And we see that from the Tower of Babel. That's kind of a major important thing. And we're going to kind of break down, there are different types of ethnicities when we go and we look at this, depending on the context. But as we look at it as a generalized people group, within a geographical bound, okay, within a specific time, they're generally going to have the same language. And that's going to be very big and very important. And that's why if you go back, and it doesn't matter, you actually see this several times within the Old Testament, but I'll give the example of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What was it that they changed their name and they changed the language that they spoke? They specifically would change it into the foreign language. And this is because they're trying to go and to change their ethnicities. They're trying to get them to assimilate into that ethnicity, into that culture, into that ethnos. That's what they're trying to get them to do. It's one of the biggest tactics to go and to do that. It's incredibly important. And bridging right into that, when you go into Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, except it was Belshazzar for his name that it was changed to. They were also changed into the names that would represent foreign gods, as opposed to Mishael, Azariah, and I don't remember what Shadrach's name was as a Jew.
You're losing points today.
I know I'm losing that. I was like, man, I can't think of what his name was. But when we look at that, they were changed from names that would represent the religion and the God of Israel to the religions and the gods of the Neo-Babylonian Empire.
Yep. Well, and that's something we see in all sorts of places. What did you do after you went from a pagan culture to a Christian culture? You adopted a what? We don't use this term as much anymore, but we refer to, sometimes they're mistakenly called Western names, but we refer to them as Christian names. This is my Christian name. It is a powerful thing for changing someone's identity and how they think about themselves. And again, language is a powerful factor, but language does not always mean people can have a shared language. And we're not talking about sort of shared. We're talking about the same language.
Right.
Just on a dialectical spectrum. So, I speak English, American English, and specifically Pacific Northwest American English, and someone from Australia, they sound like a funny version of English to me. with all
I was
sorts
going
of
to say
quirky
that
words.
you would never say that you're doing fair Midland because you're not from the Midwest, but
No. So that's dialects. And it's a huge example of that in modern times and how extreme the division can be between people groups that physically look the same, that express their culture the same in architecture, in clothing, in all these other things. Obviously on a minor spectrum, but the spectrum is from that same people to the next named version of that people. They speak the identical language, completely mutually intelligible. The only difference is what they name it. But they are bitterly at each other's throats, and they have gone to war over it. And the only difference is religion. All you have to do is look at the Balkans. The Croatians, oh my goodness, there's going to be some Croatian and Bosnian and Serbian ancestor listeners that are going to get mad at me, but it's true. The only difference between a Bosniak, a Serbian, and a Croatian is not any of the other factors in any significant degree. It's religion.
Right.
And up till the modern times, that was the definer. If you were from that region, part of this greater cultural group, but you were a Muslim, well, you were Bosnian.
Mm-hmm.
Orthodox, you're Serbian. Catholic, you're Croatian. And the divisions became so strong, just based on that one factor, that they were willing to go into a very bloody war with one another.
Right. And so religion does then change the ethnos quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Now, does it automatically, again, just like the other one, does it automatically change your ethnos? Does it change your ethnicity?
It depends on what you mean by ethnicity.
It does depend, but in the sense of like nationality, like people group, tribe.
Right.
In the sense of tribe, does it change your tribe, your ancestry?
Not necessarily. It can, but it doesn't necessarily change it. Obviously, in fact, in many ways it doesn't. But like the example that you gave, it was the defining shift there in the three different ethnos. So with that, let's because we're starting to run out of a little bit of time here.
Let's speed up a little bit. Do you want me to summarize this next point and then just get into the second part that's meatier?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so we're not going to go into verses, but are interethnic marriages okay? We're going to go to the Bible. We're going to see what the Bible says about something, and then we're going to go to another example to kind of prove the question and other things. So the Bible, you can go to Exodus 34, 10 through 16, Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 6, Genesis 23, 3 through 6. It very clearly forbids the intermixing of ethnicities, the intermarrying of peoples into Israel. They should not mix with the people around them. And that seems like it's creating an idea that ethnicity is a factor that you should consider when marrying. We're talking about, specifically, let's talk about just the idea of like a tribal ethnicity, kinship. And yes, we can talk about the fact that Israel is a slightly different case, but there's something going on. We should talk about a couple points, but let's talk about this first one. Because on the point of, is it okay? We have examples of God forbidding it for Israel, but we also have counter examples. It goes into another thing. Is ethnicity fixed? Are you stuck as one ethnicity?
Well, you're saying, is it broken? But no, that's not what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah. Genesis 23, 7. So a couple verses, well, one verse after one of the ones I mentioned previously, you can read it. And it talks about the idea that certain ethnicities were allowed to intermix with after only 3 generations.
Huh.
So
that's an interesting thing.
assimilation is possible, but we need more to that. So, Sam, do you want to intro us in a little bit about Ruth?
Yeah. So Ruth, which also side note, we need to make like the Book of Ruth a woke proof text on that. The woke have been
Oh my goodness.
have been
Yeah,
really
they've
going after that.
abused. Yeah.
But anyway, the Book of Ruth. Essentially, here you have this Israelite family that went out, where you have these. You've got, wow, sorry, just completely blanked on like everybody's names here. But anyway, you've got Naomi, and you've got her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. You have her husband too, who I'm blanking on his name at the moment. But you've got Mahlon and Chilion. They're the ones that really matter into the story. And they go and they marry two Moabite women. So one marries Ruth, the other one marries Orpah, and Mahlon and Chilion and their dad all die. And you have Naomi, you have Ruth, and you have Orpah, and they're there. And Naomi's like, I'm going back, going to be naming myself Mara because I'm really bitter. I'm going to go back. And Orpah and Ruth go and they cling to her to start off with. And she goes, no, go back to your own homes. You know, even if I were to have another child, you guys wouldn't get married to him anyway. You wouldn't wait around. So just go back to your own homes. And of course, Orpah weepingly says goodbye. And Ruth clings to Naomi instead and says, your God shall be my God. Your people shall be my people. I'm coming with you. Wherever you go, I shall go. And basically, God curse me if I don't do that. And then she ends up getting married to Boaz, and eventually down the line becomes part of the line of Jesus, because that David comes from that line. But Orpah, which it's important to go and look at this too. It doesn't just say that she went back to her people, but also she went back to her gods, their people's gods there. And I think that's a really key, important thing when it comes to this, because it's that idea of assimilation and spiritual assimilation as well.
Yeah. You could, so obviously assimilation. So over time, one people group getting supplanted by another. Their language gets removed, their cultural distinctiveness gets removed, their religion gets removed, they assimilate, and everything that made them one ethnicity is gone.
Right.
But there's another type of assimilation. Ruth was able to bypass God's commands. Well, she's a Moabite. They're forbidden to ever marry.
Yeah.
They're never allowed to intermix. So she should never be allowed to marry an Israelite, let alone, because that would make her children unclean. That would make David unclean. Eventually, that would make Jesus unclean. But we know David, only a couple generations later, isn't. He's fine.
Right.
The key factor is Ruth said, I am no longer a Moabite. I reject that as my tribe, and I reject that as my religion. I am now an Israelite. Your people are now my people. I am now an Israelite who believes in Yahweh, who believes in the God of Israel. So how do you bypass the command of they can't just naturally assimilate the Moabites? Well, it's you go, I'm no longer a Moabite. I reject that, right, and I adopt this new faith, this new identity, this new people. I am now, for all intents and purposes, an Israelite. And that's how she's treated.
Yes.
Is there something New Testament wise? Because obviously, oh no, that's Israel. Well, on the religion side, don't be unequally yoked.
Right.
As Christians, we're commanded not to marry non-believers.
And that's because they are of a different spiritual ethnos in that sense.
Which, do you have any verses that prove that point, that there's a spiritual ethnos and Christians are a spiritual ethnos?
So 1 Peter 2:9 tells us that we're a spiritual ethnos, and I believe this is the verse that goes and says that we are goes through, it says several things, like we're a royal priesthood, we're a holy nation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it and we see that there is that idea of that spiritual ethnos. Now, this isn't to go and to spiritualize everything and to say that there aren't physical people groups, because sometimes that's where people go and they take it, and then all of a sudden here they start using this for like a globalism type thing. But that's not what we're saying at all. In fact, I think it'd be really good to kind of look at the Apostle Paul. I mean, if you
Mm-hmm.
want to go more over this verse, that's fine. But I
No,
think it'd be really
I
good
think there's a
to
couple more points that we wanted to talk about, but frankly, they're abused by woke people, so I think we can just talk about them
right,
next week.
right. Um, but do you want to break down the different ethnoses that the Apostle Paul had? Because I
Not
think
just
this is fascinating.
Yeah, because it's not just stuff he had; it's stuff he claimed he still had as a Christian. As a Christian, he still
Right,
claimed to be a Roman citizen, despite
right,
claiming that his true citizenship is in heaven. He didn't renounce his Roman citizenship. He was
right. So, so,
still.
we, so we have the spiritual ethnos, right? Paul was a Christian, the greatest
Mhm.
church planter.
Yep,
Then he's a Roman citizen. What kind of ethnos is that?
that's his political ethnicity, if you want to put
Yeah,
it that way. Uh, but then he also makes it very clear that the Jews are still his brothers in the flesh. He's no longer physically, his kinship is still Jewish,
right.
but it's only in the flesh. And
And so
even when
that's
he talks about the Jews and his love for his brothers, again in the flesh, and he makes that clear, he goes back to that there's a separation. There's a more important separation between him and them. And his desire is that he wants to bridge that. He'd give up his own life, his own
it
salvation,
says yeah,
if
he'd
it
be
meant that they could
accursed.
come to
Yeah.
Christ. Yeah. So because he sees that there's a better identity, a better nationality, a better ethnicity, and that's his
Mm-hmm.
spiritual one, his Christianity.
Right. It, and so there does end up being a hierarchy within these as well, but you do see, like you said, there was a political ethnicity, an ethnicity in the flesh of what people group he would naturally be from, and then there is also the spiritual ethnicity, and that's why a lot of times we would say it depends. It depends. What
Hmm.
are you using? What is the context
Yeah.
behind these questions when people go and ask that? And it is important that we understand these contexts. And I think that that's really what we're going to see next week is that, well, some people just like to abuse this. That's one thing that we're going to see. Some people just like to
Yep.
abuse this, but we're also going to see they try to interchangeably use a word sometimes and just make it fit to whatever they're trying to make it fit to, but not
Yep.
actually using this in a contextual, in the sense of really looking at the context of what we're talking about or what is being talked about within the Bible, and they just try to kind of make square pegs fit round holes sometimes with that. Um, but I hope that you understand a little bit of what biblical ethnos and biblical ethnicity is in looking at that, and understand. I think it's really important when it comes to this. We're all from one blood. On the value side of it, there is equal value. We all come from the same biology. When you're looking at ethnicity, if you've been using it interchangeably as a synonym with race and you've been associating race with certain physical characteristics, that's not in any sense biblically what ethnos is.
Yeah.
Would you,
Frankly, when you look at it, kinship is honestly one of the relatively lower points of what an ethnicity is.
right.
Things like language and especially religion. Religion is the number one definer of things. Now, again, Israel's a slightly special case, but even in what defines an ethnicity, it's hard for dictionaries to define it because they're coming from a secular point of view. But when we put it into a Christian point of view, it makes us a lot easier to see things because we're going to put them into a hierarchy. What is most important? And unfortunately, people go to race, modern idea of race, and they fall victim to the idea of ethnic partialism because they put physical characteristics above the more important things. They put physical characteristics above perceived physical characteristics. Again, I hope I showed you some people that break your ideas of that somewhat, but they put those above more important factors.
Right.
And for us as Christians, our most important identifier does need to be with Christ. So even in the context of different uses of ethnicity, we should still go, yeah, I'm Welsh, Swedish, French, Scottish, 1/128th Cherokee.
Elizabeth Warren?
But, that's vague genetics. I don't get to put that ahead of I don't get to go fly over to Sweden and be like, my people. And even America, I don't get to go, people up here in the Northwest, oh, my people. No, my important thing is that I have a new people and I care, I care more. This is not wrong. This is exactly what Paul says. I care more about people in the Northwest. I care about how lost there is, how much lostness there is up here in the Pacific Northwest. I care about that more than I care about Iowa. I'm sorry, Sam. Because these are, according to the flesh and according to culture and according to specific language, so accent, these are my people.
Right.
But Sam, you're more important than they are. Because you're I almost said the people. Sam, you're the people. But Sam,
I just want to be the
eternity
people.
with you.
Right.
I'm going to spend eternity with you. You are my brother. You are my new kin. You are my new family. That identifier is superior. We also can't use ethnicity to just be like physical trait. That's ethnicity.
Right.
It's going to get you tied up in all sorts of knots.
Right. And that's why we have to go and look at what is the context that we're going and looking at this and we're talking about it. And even, like you said, it's even bound by time. Not just location, not just religion, not just language, but bound even by time when we go and we look at that ethnicity. Now, of course, that spiritual ethnicity that we have, in that sense, it's not going to be bound by time because we are going to have an eternity there. That, of course, transcends time in that sense. But when we're looking at those physical ethnicities, they are bound by time. And I'm excited to kind of explore this a little bit more and look at really how people misuse this, because I do think we've gained a pretty good basis and foundation biblically for this. But today we're going to get into this idea of ethnos, or maybe as a lot of people might look at this, that idea of race and how the woke use and they really weaponize this idea of race quite a bit. What are there's kind of four options we look at this of kind of viewing race in this way, or ethnos in that sense. And what are these four options, Kyle, and where does the woke generally fit into these four options?
So we're going to overly generalize a few things here.
Yeah.
So don't freak out about details because this is not an episode about each of these topics. And this is just because we need to familiarize ourselves with the four options or four categories when it comes to race before we can talk about, because race is really important to woke people. So your four options broadly are scientific race or biological race, the modernist view of things, which is evolution. It's rooted in evolution, more than just rooted in evolution. It is a part of evolution. It's the idea that race is a biological reality, a biological fact, and thus some races are superior or inferior to each other, and or more or less advanced, and or so on and so forth. But then you have sociological race. You have rooted in postmodernism as opposed to modernism. Broadly think of 20th century versus 21st century. What I mean by sociological race, race is rooted not in biological reality, but it is a social construct, sociological race. This is critical race theory. Race is not this fixed thing, it is a concept. Now, it's a concept. This always hurts my brain because it's a concept, then they still root to skin color, but then it's a social construct, but then it's also rooted in skin color, but then it makes no sense, but it doesn't have to because it's postmodern, it's post-truth. Now, both scientific and sociological race are connected to Marxism. That's something that's very important to know. If you give into this evolutionary style of race, of skin color is race, you're giving into Marxism just as much as someone that's giving into critical race theory.
That's right.
Now, if you don't understand what we're talking about there, we had 2 episodes with Kevin McGarry that you can go listen to. Darwin, Father of Hate, and I Will Dethrone God, Karl Marx. He really helped us see the connections between Marxism and Darwinism, and just kind of how these thoughts grew over time. Now, the third category we're going to talk about is colorblind. So the other option of race is to be, quote, colorblind. We're going to split hairs a tiny bit between this and the fourth option. But as a generalization, it far too often becomes a bury your head in the sand style of approach. Rather than really confront the question, it's, well, the question doesn't exist, so I don't have to answer it. It gets some things right. It's right to reject the idea of skin color as race and different races of humanity, and instead brightly points out that there's only one race, the human race, all created by God, all children of Noah, all children of Adam and Eve. But we're going to contrast that with biblical ethnos, what we talked about last time. Race, either scientific or sociological, isn't real. Again, we're going to agree with the colorblind view there. But like we said, the colorblind view doesn't usually go far enough to explain what ethnos is, to explain what the actual reality is of diversity among humanity. Now, ethnos, super summarizing our last episode, is not one thing. And that's a huge problem that people make. They make it a single thing. And it is more denoting of groups via some sort of shared identity, some sort of shared reality that they all have. Now, it's important to know, again, just these 4 kind of categories of race, views of race, as well as just what biblical ethnicity is. But now that we've summarized things, Sam, what are we moving on to? What are we doing with that information that we briefly covered?
Yeah, well, we're going to be taking that information and we're going to be identifying which ones the woke use. And of course, this idea of how the woke abuse ethnos. Because, I mean, we are Wokepedia, so we're out here looking at this idea that the woke do abuse ethnos, or this idea of race or ethnicity that we're going to be looking at. And I just want to say, that breakdown that you just had was absolutely excellent of these 4 views. And I do think that it's important to understand and to make that distinction between that scientific race of modernism and that sociological race of postmodernism, because oftentimes they kind of get lumped into just one thing. And though they are extremely close together, there is a little bit of a difference there that, no pun intended, that Darwinism has evolved, so to say. And I think that this is really important to understand because from a Christian perspective, the apologetics or how we're defending our faith, it's generally viewed through a lens of specifically defending the modernism, and it's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of times not equipped to defend against postmodernism, which
Mm-hmm.
is really why a lot of the big name apologists either fell into wokeism or completely didn't put up a fight against wokeism or
Yep.
tolerated wokeism, is because they were only trained to fight modernism and they had no
Yep.
idea as to what to do when it came to postmodernism. I know
Oh,
that's not
yeah.
exactly where we're planning on going with this, but I feel like I kind of opened a door that you might want to comment on there, Kyle.
Well, I'll make two comments on that. You're more right than you might even realize, and you're definitely more right than I think most of the audience will admit. Apologist friend of mine, and I'm not talking just a random guy who says he's an apologist. I mean a world class apologist, um, has been complaining about that for years. Guys, the era of atheism is over. The era of modernism is over. We're now dealing with neo paganism. We're now dealing
Right.
with a postmodern and even sort of going beyond postmodern culture. Apologetics needs to shift its guns or else it's going to get blindsided. Now, on that, we're actually going to get a couple people on. We don't have this episode 100% scheduled at this point, but probably within the next month, we're going to be doing an episode that's actually going to be talking about this. That's going to be
That's
a fun
exciting.
one.
That will be.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I mean I I just think it's an interesting it's an interesting thing, but it's also an important thing to understand. But it really, like I said, it kind of opened the door a little bit there when we look at scientific ethnos and sociological ethnos, or scientific race and sociological race. But how do the woke abuse ethnos? That's really what we want to get into today. And fundamental one that is seen across the spectrum here is adding a skin color to the list of ethnicities. So
Mm.
you've probably seen this before, Kyle. In fact, you might have a personal story a little bit on this. Have you ever seen this where the woke add skin color?
Yeah. So obviously, I think a lot of people can point out examples. It's not super hard. Uh, and the other points we're going to talk about all include this. That's
Mm-hmm.
why we need to talk about kind of this fundamental thing that they do right off the bat.
Right.
But I have an example that I'm going to talk about a tiny bit, which is when I was doing church planting through the Southern Baptist Convention's North American Mission Board. Sort of, I always like to give the sort of in there because I wasn't initially working directly with them. That's part of the drama of the story. But I had to, well, fascinating thing, I had to take all these assessments, all these questionnaires and things. But because of a system update they did partway through, I had to retake them all. Now, the reason that they did that is because they pushed out new ones. And what I noticed immediately is the new one was obsessed with ethnicity and it was asking all sorts of questions, tons of questions about like when was the last time you shared the gospel with someone of a different ethnicity? How often are you interacting with people of different ethnicities? And I'm going through it, and because I have a, I'm not going to toot my own horn because I have a right view of ethnicity, and I assumed that they were using it biblically. I didn't even think about the wording of the questions. I just saw the general thing in ethnicity, and I was like, okay, where I am, I don't deal with many people of different ethnicities. I'm dealing with almost exclusively Americans.
Right.
I went to a high school which had tons of exchange students, but that was high school. I'm not generally dealing with people of different ethnicities. So I was answering honestly until finally I read the question as it was written, not as I was interpreting it, and went, oh, by ethnicity, they mean skin color. And once I realized that, it was just blatantly obvious in all the questions. That's what they were talking about. They weren't talking about people of legitimately different national identities, different, obviously they're not going to use it for spiritual identity because people almost generally never do that, or people of different cultures. They meant skin color.
Right.
And which would have changed my answers radically. But it was so, I think it hit me like a ton of bricks because it was blatantly obvious once you realized it. I was like, that's not how this works. Why are you doing that? But it's because they had an agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you want more about the agenda, you can watch Enemies Within the Church. It talks about some of that, specifically with North American Mission Board. Part of my videos in there. You can go watch my video that talks about it. I've linked it before and other things. But yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem because they have an agenda.
They do have an agenda. And I think that's one of the biggest points of really looking at this fundamental idea of adding a skin color to ethnicities is that they do have an agenda. They're pushing an agenda. Wokeism isn't by accident, and the abuse of ethnos that the woke use is not by accident. And I think that's important for us to understand, because a lot of times, especially within Christian circles, we tend to, I don't know, be overly extending and gracious towards things, and towards people. And it's not bad, of course, to be gracious. It's not bad, of course, to really look at these kind of things and maybe look at it in the best possible light. But sometimes we might give them the benefit of the doubt when we shouldn't, or they might ask us to do that. In fact, we did an episode on that, and you can go ahead and check out that episode on how the woke manipulate, and it was on giving the benefit of the doubt. I think that'd be very helpful for people to understand. But it's not just that they add skin colors, it's that they also reorder the priority of things. And this includes adding skin colors. So instead of God, kin, and citizenship, what does it become?
Well, often it becomes skin, kin, God, and then citizenship. I find it fascinating that citizenship usually still ends up last.
Yeah, it is. Now, I think that's kind of important because the woke ideology is also kind of inherently globalist, wouldn't you say? And I think this is an interesting concept when you look at that. We won't get really far into globalism today, but when you look at with ethnicity and this idea of confusing ethnicity or reordering it in the wrong way, is that you're to have an inherent loyalty to a people group that's based upon your skin color as to what they'll go and say, but you're not to have an inherent loyalty to a people group who you're born around and share a culture with. Doesn't that just seem a little backwards? I don't know. I just kind of was thinking on that. Well,
yeah, it's weird. It's just weird, and it doesn't make it creates a wall of division, of hostility. It can't not. And that's one of the problems. No matter how you rearrange things, if as soon as you rearrange the priorities, it's going to automatically start throwing up walls and divisions and putting people at each other's throats. It's not just critical race theory. It's not just critical theory that does that. It happens anytime you get these things out of whack. But the way they do it just amplifies it because they create new categories to divide us along.
Mm-hmm. It really, this is where that idea of the oppression Olympics really does come in, as they create new categories to go and to divide us. But to get back to this idea of the right order, it's God, kin, and citizenship. Of course, your ultimate allegiance should be to God. Your second allegiance should be to kin, those people who are around you, which is, really important. I mean, God tells us in his word that the person who doesn't provide for his own, well, he's worse than an infidel. is what it goes and it says. So you're worse than an unbeliever in that sense if you're not providing for your own. And then the third one there is citizenship. It is important. We talked about this a little bit last week, and we would encourage you to go and to check out that episode. The Apostle Paul did have a Roman ethnos. He did claim Roman citizenship, and he used that. And it wasn't just for his advantage. He really did identify as a Roman because he was a Roman in that sense. He really did have that citizenship. But the woke, as you pointed out, Kyle, it's a wrong reordering. They reorder it and they say skin. So first of all, they add something else in. So your skin color, which the interesting thing is that I think you're right. They do put that even above kin, although they do put kin in there next. And then they put in God. And then finally they put in citizenship. Sometimes I think they would probably argue that they put God first, but that's just in words only, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. There's a difference between saying you believe something and actually believing it. It's one of the things that, it's a tactic that they use. It's a tactic, and we're going to have to talk about it at some point in our How the Woke Manipulate series. But it's that idea of, it's like paper theology. Saying I believe the essentials of the faith. Here, I believe these things. I agree with them. And then going out and immediately contradicting them. Don't just look at what someone says in one space and say, oh, that's it. That's what they believe. You have to actually look at what else do they say and what do they put into practice? Now, it's one of the reasons that this can be complicated to really nail them down on, because sometimes they do just use a lot of, something else we talked about, specific vagueness. It seems very particular and specific, but it's left so vague as to appeal to everyone. So you can struggle to figure out what their order actually is. Are they just weakening, lowering our loyalty to God, elevating skin? Are they switching them? Are they just kind of making it confusing? But let's be clear. Even if they were simply elevating skin and or somewhat diminishing our loyalty to God, you've already got it infinitely out of whack at that point. And I do mean infinitely. Why? Because God puts them on infinite scales. Our new ethnos as a child of God is not just kinda, not just sort of, not just a lot superior to everything else. It's to be so superior as to make our other relations, our other ethnicities, our other loyalties look like hate in comparison. Christ directly addresses that. You can go read Luke 14:26, and you see him address that concept of our loyalty to Christ, our love of God is supposed to make everything else look like hate. So when you put these in an order of priority, it's not just God first. It is God fully and then the others. So even if they start to tweak that, it messes it up.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. And you really touched on this, the importance of God being first, because that is our new ethnos. That is our primary ethnos. That's the ethnos that we're to have. We're a child of God. We have a new nature. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. And I know there are some people who'd be listening to that and they would say, oh, look, you're actually going down a woke route when you're saying that. No, I'm not denying the other ethnoses that we have, the other, there's other things. I'm just simply stating that when God says in John 1:12, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe on his name, that God meant what he said and he said what he meant, and we did become a child of God. That in John 3, when it talks about being born again, we actually were born again. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, that old things have passed away, behold, all things have become new, that we're new creatures, that we're new creations in Christ Jesus. That actually happened. And because of that, I think you touched on something that's really important, Kyle. And that is that we love God 100%, 100% with everything we are. And the other things flow from that. So therefore, in looking at that, it's as though we even hate other people because we love God so much. Husbands, your love for God should, in comparison, be so much greater than your love for your wife that it looks like you hate your wife, but you should still love your wife. That's the reality of it. Like God commands you, husbands, love your wives, but you should love God so much the more. But do you have another example of this here of our good friend Dottie Lewis?
Yeah, so this is a clip of Dottie Lewis and Derwin Gray. And there's other people in it, but this clip is just them two talking in it that demonstrates a little bit of this principle. And again, here at Wikipedia, we don't just like to talk about theoretical. We like to give you some examples you can sink your teeth into. So let's go ahead.
Oftentimes we talk about sin of, or we talk about this whole idea of the gospel solely as the goal of Christianity is a fight for perfection instead of a fight against isolation, right? It's because the gospel brings us together, but it seems like the wall has been torn down in Ephesians chapter 2 and 11, and we're spending all our time building the wall back up as believers, and that is what's causing the division.
What I would add is majority culture will often see themselves as the dominant group in the text. Yeah. What if whiteness is the Gentiles?
Yeah.
Because so often it is, right?
Exactly.
And so, but a lot of times people approach it as though, okay, you blacks and people of color, y'all come in and be a part of us. Right. You see what I'm saying?
No, you're right.
Versus saying, no, we are us.
Yeah.
We are the they. We are the us.
Kyle, I've got a question. What if blackness was the Gentiles? Oh, does that seem kind of racist to everybody when I say it? I mean, and by the way, both whiteness and blackness, in a sense, were Gentiles because Gentiles are anybody who's not Jews. And in case anybody was curious on that.
Yeah.
Really? I love how Dottie Lewis starts off and he's like, says in Ephesians 2 that the walls are torn down, but I feel like we spend all our time building the walls up. And I just wanted to say, finally, something we can agree upon. You're building racial walls.
Yeah, that's the irony of it. This whole conversation, you can listen more on it, and they will claim that they're doing the opposite of something, and then they start doing it themselves. People are building up these walls, these racial walls. Let's talk about how we build up these racial walls. Let's categorize people by their skin color and say that there's a division between them, and then somehow we're not building up the walls. Let's talk about how we're divided along these things, these skin colors, and then immediately, because if you listen on, Derwin's going to start to sound like he's saying that the church is a new ethnicity, a new identity. But you realize what he just said, and then what he goes on to say later, he fully contradicts. If that's actually what he's saying, he fully contradicts it, because he wants to categorize people by their physical appearance and put them into monolithic groups based on no actual connection to each other, but based on skin. And then say, so he creates the category of skin. And then he says, okay, I got to put it in this priority system of ethnicity. And so I'm going to shove it in here. And at best, I'm going to make it compete with our Christian identity, if not supplant it. And you can see the reordering of that. And you can see, I think in that clip, you can also see them kind of struggling with that idea of church versus skin?
I mean, it's an interesting thing that they're doing this roundtable, and they're talking about this in such a way that they're clearly reordering and getting this wrong of skin, and then God. Obviously, I think probably Kin's in there. They didn't go super advanced on where they're all talking about this, but it became this idea of segregating people with their skin color, and that's what they were obsessed with, and that's what they're bringing ethnos. What are the things that actually bring us together? Even when they're going and talking about breaking down the walls of of racial segregation or racial identity, and saying, hey, we're building the, it seems like we spend all our time building it up. What is it exactly that they go and they do? Well, the solution they bring is to build it up, to build more racial walls, as opposed to going and saying, we're Christians, we're looking at our Christian identity. It's still whiteness, blackness, all that kind of stuff. It's critical race theory.
Yeah, ultimately, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, there's ethnic, the next way that they abuse this is that they really bring that partiality, that ethnic partiality. And it is based on skin color or racism. And we see this. We see this even in the video that you just that we just watched, but it's showing favoritism based on some ethnic factor. And to be fair, they do seem to not just use skin color for this one. They tend to use other things as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's even in that last clip, you heard them talking about majority culture. Now, when he said majority culture, he wasn't actually talking about culture. He was talking about skin color. And they have a problem with, they like to conflate skin color and ethnicity. They also like to conflate culture and skin color, and they conflate everything. They don't take the time. It's funny how the winsome and nuanced people don't take the time to show the nuance of the word ethnos and how it can be applied to different things, how the Bible applies it to different things. It frustrates me. But I think before we talk more about this point, I think bringing up a poignant example of it would probably help answer a lot of it and spark the discussion to the next level. So do you have any problem with skipping right to the clip we have for this one?
No, I think that's an excellent idea.
Okay, so this is going to be Matt Chandler, and he's going to give us two different examples here. So let's go ahead and listen to this.
I am not asking you to find the black person that agrees with you. Becoming friends with the African American that agrees with everything you say isn't helpful to you as a white evangelical, and probably has that African American trying to win approval or position. We've been looking and having conversations, and I have called every African American man I know and went, who you got? Here's what I need. How do I, help me, right? I've got a lot of white friends, but what I would love to just say, here's 2,000 people in an $11 million building, go lead them. And so one of the firms that's helping us find men said, let me ask you a question, Pastor Matt. If we find an Anglo 8 and an African American 7, which one do you want? I said, I want the African American 7. And he said, what if we find an Anglo 8 and an African American 6? And then I said, then give me the Anglo 8, because the African American 6 will look and feel to our people like the kind of tokenism that I'm preaching against.
Sam, you hadn't heard that clip before. Were you prepared for that?
No. Just simply no. I was not prepared for that. Yeah, I don't even really know what to say about this, because just the logic, it is absurd. So, hey, I want somebody who's lesser based on their skin color, but if they're too much lesser, I don't want that, because then they might feel like they're just a token. And I'm preaching against tokenism. But I just said that I would take the token guy because they were the inferior candidate.
Yeah. So
I like
is it clear? Is it clear why we're using that for ethnic partiality?
Yes. It is extremely clear why we're using that for ethnic partiality. I mean, and this is the problem. It's partial, and then not only was it partial, but it was insult to injury by going and saying, "Look, they'd be too stupid to know that they're a token if they're just slightly less. But if there's a big disparity, well, then they'd probably figure it out." And it wasn't even in the sense of like like think about this. He's not even caring in what his job is. He's sitting here saying, "I'm not looking for who God's man is for the job. I'm not looking for the best person that I can possibly get into this position. It's the idea of, well, let's find somebody who has this skin color and who's close to maybe being good, who maybe is the second or third choice. But make sure he's not like the eighth choice, because that wouldn't be good."
Oh, it's so bad. And so not only is it showing, because it's showing both positive and negative partiality at the same time. And I'm not talking positive towards one group, negative towards, no, I'm saying both. To the black candidate, it is showing both positive and negative. Showing positive partiality in the sense it's giving him something he doesn't deserve. Negative in the sense of saying that he's so incompetent and incapable, he can't get this position on his own merit. It's
Right.
shocking. And before we miss it, there was the other comments he made, and I'm sorry, I had to edit it so it wouldn't be so long. So the gap between them was really, really minuscule. But right at the beginning, he talked about making friends. And his encouragement was, you're supposed to make friends. If you're a white person, you're supposed to make friends with black people. But you're not supposed to make friends with those black people that agree with you, because then you're just in some sort of like echo chamber where you're not learning the Gnostic insights that you're supposed to be getting. And you're also putting that person is just trying to earn favor with you by telling you what you want to hear. Like, that's so offensive. Again, that's showing both positive and negative. It's saying their black-skinned people are so stupid that they need me to do it for them. Like,
Right.
it's just ridiculously offensive. So it's not only just like, it's not just positive partiality, it's negative too. It's based on skin color, and that's what you would traditionally call racism.
That's right.
It hurts my brain.
Yeah,
And
I don't even know what to say about. I mean, that is so ridiculous that you would, first of all, have that position, but then it's like, okay, we understand there are people who have that position within the woke, but to say the silent part out loud, it is, and to say it out loud on a camera is befuddling. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know what's in, Matt Chandler's Instagram direct message box, and it might be pretty bad that's in there, but like, this was really bad. This should have been enough to get him to, go away for a while.
Well, I don't get how these woke people, I don't get how the crowd listening to that, whether they were conservative or woke, I don't get how either side wouldn't stand up and go, dude, what you're saying is crazy offensive.
Right.
And just wrong on every level.
I mean, I would think that the woke would be like, dude, he just white-splained that to me, I tried to make that up, but, I didn't really quite go over as well as I was hoping. He Anglo-splained it to me, I guess.
Stop Anglo-splaining to me.
Right. Maybe I shouldn't be trying to help out the woke here because they're probably going to start using that phrase now.
Oh no!
You're just Anglo-splaining. Anyway, I do think that this is kind of one of those. I don't think that we can really explain this position better than what Matt Chandler just did for everyone. And by the way, for those of you who are curious, Matt Chandler is woke. And that's important to understand because a lot of people try to protect Matt Chandler because they really appreciate Matt Chandler and his, ministry from years back and stuff like that. But he is woke. His church, my goodness, they sang about microaggressions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Literally wrote like a song about microaggressions. I mean, it's a ridiculous kind of a thing. But the woke abuse ethnos in another way. It's not just this idea of reordering or confusing the priorities or this ethnic partiality or adding skin color as an ethnos, although that's one that's been throughout all of this. They also simply judge people based on ethnic categories that they make up, and they put those people into, either this systemic oppression or the white privilege group, or they kind of put them into an oppressed group, which of course brings in this Marxist aspect of the cultural Marxist aspect of oppressor versus oppressed, which is something that they really do bring into this. What would be this idea of white? Have you heard somebody use this of white privilege before or systemic oppression? I know you have, but it'd be good for people to hear it, I guess.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, we've already talked, and we've talked all the time about how those are Marxist terms, at least when they're being properly used. Now, someone can ignorantly say it, but have a completely different meaning. But we're saying in their context, these are Marxist terms. Now, you shouldn't be using them ignorantly. You should know what they mean, and you should know how problematic they are. But yeah, I think we've all heard them at this point. And they really do. They rely on this idea of categorizing people. Again, specifically based on their made up categories. And we're talking about critical race theory because when we're talking about ethnos, that's the aspect of wokeness that we're talking about, critical race theory. It lumps people into categories, into groups based on their skin color, and then makes judgments about them based not on their content, not on their beliefs, not on their actions, on nothing else other than their skin color. And then, again, further categorizes them. Oh, you are what I have now deemed a white person. You are now have these qualities. You are now a oppressor. You are now a beneficiary of white privilege. And it doesn't matter what you say, what you do, or who you are part of that category. It's funny. They have to create the problem to provide the solution. It's something we've mentioned before, but they really do have to. They have to create the category to put you in, to then say that's here you go. I'm going to create this category, put you in it, and then tell you that it's wrong that you're in that category. Well, I'm not in that category, but I've said you are. Therefore, you are. It's, oh my God, it's so much a tautology. But Tim Keller made this point for us in a way that really drives home how absurd it is, how much they force you into these categories and then judge you based on them. So let's go ahead and listen to this little clip of Tim Keller that's just... Again, it's like that Chandler clip. It's going to make the point.
A friend of mine who's a pastor was talking to a Norwegian man who had just moved into his community and went to his church. And at one point, he heard pastor talking about the fact that we are all complicit in creating this narrative that black people are dangerous, etc. The Norwegian came up and said, no, I'm Norwegian. I had nothing to do with it. And my pastor friend said, studies have shown that if you have white skin, it's worth $1 million over a lifetime over somebody who doesn't have white skin. If you have that asset of white skin, skin right now, then you actually have to say, to some degree, I'm standing on the shoulders of other people who got that through injustice. The Bible actually says you are involved in injustice, and even if you didn't actually do it, you're part of the problem. You can't escape the history. You can't just say, I wasn't part of that.
Like I said, I think that makes the point pretty darn well.
Yeah.
Do you also notice how much dehumanizing language was in there as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's dehumanizing. It's that idea of white skin is worth $1 million. What? What are we talking about, man? Like,
It's also an asset.
yeah,
You're no longer a person. You're no longer a human. You're now an asset that has a value attached to it.
Yeah, I mean that it's crazy because it's critical race theory and this whole idea. I mean, this whole idea of racism. It's not a new concept. We understand that, but this is why we are calling what the woke is doing and how they're abusing ethnos as racist, because they're literally putting a price on a person based upon their skin color. Like, people have done that in the past before. And there were, people who were selling human beings based mostly on their skin color from slave blocks.
Yep.
It's the same thing.
It's absurd. It's absurd.
But one thing that I think that's interesting about this, Kyle, is that it's not just the woke. It's not just the woke and the leftists who kind of get ethnos wrong and abuse ethnos. In fact, quote unquote conservatives kind of fall into the same traps and issues based upon their poor definition of ethnos. Now, we don't want to say that we're calling these people woke, because they're not woke, but they're falling into the same problems on this issue. They might not have a lot of the other tenets of wokeism. They are obviously looking at this from a different perspective, but we have some examples of this. And I don't know, which one should we start with here? Because,
well, before we even start that, I want to say something. It's something that we've reiterated at other times, and I feel more need to mention it when we're going after someone. We're not going after this person. We have a couple examples. They're from the same person, because they're just obvious. That's why we're using them. But again, the Wikipedia promise is, if you are ever mentioned on this program or in our written content, that is an invitation to come onto the program to discuss with us. Whether you agree, disagree, whatever it is, you're allowed to come on, make your case. We're confident in our assertions. We're confident in our positions. So we're fine with having you on, because we feel like we can still make our case, make our point, but we are willing to hear you out. So when we talk about someone here, this is not an attack. This is not a jab. This is nothing else besides they made some comments that show this off. Some comments that they have also said that they do not agree with as they were worded when they were said. But they make the point more clearly than most others we've seen, so we are using them. Is that a fair disclaimer, Sam?
I think it's a very fair disclaimer. And, the person, we're going to use a couple of examples from the same person. This isn't the only person who does this. It's just they were blatant examples. And I mean, one of them was in response to me on Twitter. So it was right at our fingertips kind of a thing. So, I mean, there's that. But also it's because, obviously the point of this episode was to expose how the woke are misusing ethnos and how they're abusing ethnos. And so we just wanted to go into show that we understand it's not just the woke who are falling into these categorical errors and are, missing the mark on ethnos. We understand that. And so we just kind of want to be fair and to paint this picture that we're not being a tribalistic podcast or something like that,
Yeah.
we understand this. And so which one do you think would be best to bring up first?
Well, I think we should bring up the one that we've mentioned before.
Yeah.
We essentially mentioned why it was wrong, but we were mentioning in a different context, so we'll clarify now. But it's a tweet by Stephen Wolf. And Stephen, honestly, we really do. We would really like to have you on here to have a back and forth discussion about a few things, and just have a discussion on some certain topics in general. But and one of the reasons we're putting so much clarification is because there is so much drama going on between a camp somewhat centered around Stephen Wolf and a camp somewhat centered around G3. But the tweet is, white evangelicals are the lone bulwark against moral insanity in America.
Yeah. And before we really break this down, I really do want to reiterate that whole idea of bringing Stephen on and creating the discussion of if he'd be willing to come on. And Stephen, please come on, because I mean, the G3 guys are all blocking me on Twitter. So my Twitter is getting a lot less fun. So it'd be fun at least if somebody interacted with me. But sorry, just had to point that out. No. To get back to the actual tweet here. White evangelicals are the lone bulwark against moral insanity in America. Now, this was one where we had a lot of disagreement, not amongst ourselves, not amongst me and you, Kyle, but with a lot of people who have stood really strong against social justice here recently, and we've stood with in a lot of contexts. But I want to know, on your point, what's the big problem that you see in this? Because I think it's similar, probably the exact same as to the big problem that I see with this tweet.
So the big problem and why, so he explained what he meant by it, and that satisfied a lot of people. But there's a more fundamental, that was working forwards. That was adding more to the explanation, but we got to work backwards to the fundamental assumptions. And that's where we run into an issue with it, because the fundamental assumption assumes that there are certain categories that exist. And one of those categories is, we're going to ignore the evangelical part, but there's something to comment there. If you go watch our video on the G3 versus Christian nationalist debate, we talk about that sort of aspect of it somewhat more, but it assumes the existence of this category of white.
Right. And with that, just so that everybody understands that we're consistent, and this is exactly what we're saying, the fundamental, how do the woke abuse ethnos? It's by adding skin color to the list of ethnicities. I mean, it is like, I'll put it out here. Is he talking about the evangelicals in South Africa that are white? No, he's not. But just so everybody knows, there are white evangelicals in South Africa. Like, we could go and say that, but that's not the ethnicity that he'd be talking about. That's not the ethnos that he'd be talking about. He'd be going, oh, no, I'm talking about something totally different. Well, then why are you adding that as a category? Like, that's not part of the ethnos.
It confuses the conversation, but, and again, his explanation was that he's using voting blocks, which there's a conversation there of why that's problematic even to use that. But again, he's using it in a sort of ethnic way. He's using white in a sort of ethnic way that, again, talking about sort of the different kinds of ways that the woke abuse things. He's adding in something there that, or he's assuming the existence of it, that this already exists, therefore we can use it.
Right.
And that's the problem.
Right. And I mean, one of the things, of course, that is brought up is it's the idea of going, why is it necessary to have white in this when it would be just as true, probably more true, to go and to say evangelicals are the lone bulwark against moral insanity in America? And that's
Yeah.
the thing of the words that he chose were deliberate. They were intentional. It reveals, and if it wasn't deliberate and intentional, then that means it was part of his subconscious, which is even scarier in that sense, that it would be imprinted in that. And people don't understand that there's an issue here. Now, the argument that came across Twitter quite a bit was, well, you're nitpicking. You're nitpicking at something. And the reality of it is that if you're looking at, in a voting block, I don't think it is nitpicking in that aspect, because the question is what are you looking for? What are you trying to stereotype when you're going and doing that? Because when you're talking about a voting block, the reality of it is if you get involved in politics, you're trying to stereotype. You know, a a boomer is going to vote generally this way 67% of the time. I'm just making statistics up, but 67% of the times. Well, then you're looking for a certain age group because they're going to be voting this percentage of time in this direction. And so that way, if you find that person, they're going to do that. They're going to go and do that. And so then it becomes a numbers game. And so if he is talking about voting blocks, the issue is that he's trying to stereotype in a very specific way within a skin color, that it wouldn't even be beneficial, because what are you looking now for white people who happen to be wearing a "What Would Jesus Do" bracelet? Is that what he's trying to get at? Probably not. And so it becomes just kind of goofy. But should we move on to the next one?
Well, the last comment I'll say on there is the idea of now stereotyping can send the wrong message. And I want to use a little bit of stronger terminology there of categorizing, of placing people into, again, we're alluding to the ideas of what critical race theory does. It wants people to be slotted into these new categories. Again, we're not saying he's using critical race theory. We're just saying you empower those kind of ideas when you adopt the same kind of categories. But in voting blocks and the people that utilize these predominantly, who did they favor? They favor the Democrats. Democrats use voting blocks as a bludgeon to try and force people to vote certain ways.
Right.
They want there to be a wall of separation between Christians of all skin colors, so they make sure that they isolate them into different voting blocks and say, what did Joe Biden say? You're not black if you don't vote for me. That's what they want. So adopting their category in that way, you are empowering them. It's why we need to not do that. We need to beat them back with proper category, proper ethnos.
Right. So we probably just have time to look at maybe one, maybe two more, but the one where he came and responded to me. Now, granted, I had retweeted something that he had said because he was trying to make the argument that that wokeism is not Marxist. It's actually just classically liberal. Now, I'm not a classical liberalist. I don't know if that's the right term, but I don't believe in classical liberalism. And I also, but it's self-evident. And if you've listened to the Wikipedia podcast, you probably understand this. Wokeism is in relation to Marxism. In fact, I think one of the best ones we've talked about this episode a couple times today is Kevin McGarry's the interviews that we did with Kevin McGarry. He really does a good job of laying that out, especially with Darwin and Marx. And quite frankly, and if Stephen were on our show, I would say the same thing. It's an absurd, silly comment that he's trying to make, and an absurd, silly point. In fact, it's quite dumb to go and say that wokeism isn't Marxism. It's classical liberalism. Now, I maybe we should do an episode on that sometime, Kyle, on classical liberalism providing a way for Marxism, because we talked about this. We do think that that's a possibility.
Oh yeah.
But my response to that was wokeness is Marxist. This is a stupid thread. Liberalism simply has no defense towards cultural Marxism, but woke ideology is Marxist, specifically cultural Marxism. In his response, instead of dealing with anything that I said, he asked me a question. And his question is, what's your solution to racial group disparities? Now I text you on this one, Kyle, or maybe you text me.
Yeah.
But I was like, I don't even know what he's talking about.
Yeah, we were both kind of scratching our heads trying to figure out the connection between what he initially said, Sam's response, and then his question, because it seems to come out of nowhere. Now, the kind of thing, well, at least that I came down to, I guess I didn't ask if you share the opinion, was the problem is we were reading the question wrong. We were assuming things about it, but not taking it at its face value. And its face value, now he never responded, and that's one of the problems here. He's leaving something hanging.
Right.
Now, I don't know how it would be changed in a fundamental way, but he seems to be indicating here that Sam's position is wrong because it doesn't have a solution for racial group disparities. He's assuming that racial group disparities, and this is what I finally realized. I realized the question is assuming, at face value, read for what it is, that racial disparities exist, and that a political social ideology must have a solution for them.
Right. I that's the only thing that I to tell you the truth, until you'd presented that option, I was just kind of scratching my head going, I thought maybe he thought I was promoting classical liberalism in promoting like wokeness in his idea. And it was kind of this like, haha, I got you question, because you're going to answer with this woke stuff as to how to answer it. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense if you have any context as to, like, if you read what I said, it doesn't make any sense. And if you had any context for who I was, if you spent, like 3 seconds looking at my Twitter profile, you'd understand I'm not going to answer woke. And so I think the only thing that makes sense is to take him as an honest question, where he's assuming that your political answer and ideology has to have an answer for racial disparities.
Yeah, what does that assume? And again, he's using racial, he's using the idea of skin color.
Right.
He's assuming that skin color exists. It is it makes a racial category, it makes a group, an ethnos, and that there are disparities that must be addressed.
Right.
Which, again, that's something that when we're bringing these up, we're not saying, oh man, look at Stephen Wolfe. He's not woke, but he's something like them. We're saying how he's adopted. We all have. Let's be frank. We've all, to some degree, adopted these ideas because we were raised in them and they've been bombarded at us, and we're having to remove them.
We do live in systemic racism. Is that what you're saying? We do live in systemic racism.
We live in a system that tries to push racism onto us, but in a much, much different way than the term systemic racism.
Yeah.
But he's, in trying to fight against certain things, he's brought some of it back in. He hasn't left their categories. Again, it's what we talked about, how the woke manipulate operating in their paradigm. They want you to be in that position because it neuters your response. But I hope you can see how Stephen has unfortunately brought back in these incorrect uses of ethnos And I hope you can see how they're mirroring the same types, not the same ideological underpinning and not the same outworking, but how it's adopted very similar, very, very similar ways that the woke are abusing them.
Right.
Why?
And
Because he's unfortunately bought into their same categories. Once you bought into the category, your response will necessarily what? It'll echo it.
right. He is working from their paradigm. He is accepting their premises. And really, at best, that just makes a poor argument. And at worst, it puts you into some really weird theology. I'm not exactly sure where Stephen's at in that perspective between those two.
Oh yeah.
Those two things.
And this isn't a discussion of that either. So,
Right.
we're not diving into that.
Right. The point that we're making today is simply that the woke abuse ethnos. We discussed what this ethnos is, and you can check that out. And we'd be, glad to answer any questions. But also, we do need to understand that there are other, well, actually, it's the same errors that the woke make. You can make it from a different perspective with a different ideological underpinning and still be an error. And our goal is not to point out the woke error by making the same errors just on the other side in a different ditch. Our goal is to land on biblical truth, to proclaim biblical truth, and hopefully to lead others to biblical truth.
Amen.
Well, Kyle, I think that's all we got time for today.
I think that is enough ground to cover. We had a lot of ground to cover in these 2 episodes, but I think we've provided enough response that you can come to a much better understanding of ethnos, what it is, how it's abused. So we hope that's helpful. But if you have more questions, again, throw them down into the comments. If you're on a platform that allows comments, email us, contactwikipedia@gmail.com. If you found this discussion extra helpful, a useful resource, share it with other people so that they can have a firmer foundation. We want you to be standing on firm, solid ground, absolutely rock solid, which is, again, why we were pointing out some of the conservative misuses of things, because we want to remove any sandy soil, dust the stones off, so you're standing firmly on rock, and that you can fight these things, because the woke, they're in sinking sand.
Yeah.
If we can get our footing underneath us, we're in a much better position. That's what we want. So we hope this has been useful. Share it with other people so that they can be on that same strong foundational bedrock. And Sam, you got anything else to close us out with?
The only thing I can think of is keep standing for the truth.
And remember, don't go woke.